The cinema and nation, there are a couple of things which come back to me from my work during the research that I did on early cinema. Um, I'll start off with the point that Ravi made about nation and nation state. In India, it is a very conflicted binary to work with. Um, the problem of distinguishing this binary, which is more easily done in the West than in India, is that the Nehruvian nation state worked with, in collaboration or in kind of partnership with certain older forms of local governance, local community formation, and so on and so forth. So, say for example, the police or the postal department was fairly not really disciplined into a modernist kind of ethos. They were allowed to go on with their older methods of work. There was a certain kind of understanding, and there was, in this sense, the Nehruvian government was far more subtle and far more diverse than it's been made out to be. That, it was really a kind of cut and paste, trial and error kind of state formation, where people were aware that this area shouldn't be intervened, and there was a kind of sixth sense which kind of worked that these kind of things work well, efficiently for that particular problematic for those number of years. And then, of course, as time changes, those systems become ossified, then people would try and think about finding various ways. So, the nation, the lyricism of the nation, which in some ways has been taken up by ideologies as well as critics as representing some kind of a region or a place that Moinak is talking about, is something which is made up of cultural habits, celebrations, festivals, made up of peoples, and in some ways there is something added to it, which is labor's defense of national territories, which is also in some ways folklorized, songs are sung about it. That's a certain kind of a carnivalesque notion about a space and what people can do with it, be happy, defend it, work towards the best of your community, your neighbor, and so on and so forth. That is a kind of idea that the Nehruvian state worked with when the word nation was invoked. You can see that in the advertisements of the period, the kind of advertisements, all of India, all faiths together with their always festivities were a big thing. It's a land of Christmas and Eid and so on and so forth. Now the nation state is a much more disciplined kind of space where people are under the bureaucracy or under capitalism. Now, that second order of disciplining that we find in the West is also not there in India. Capitalism was, in some very substantial ways, kept away from disciplining the labor forces of India in some very distinctive ways. In the peripheries, yes, capitalism ran rampant, but they ran rampant in areas where there was a huge gap between the capitalist class and a very subaltern and almost outside the pale of the Indic kind of world, tribals and the kind of scheduled caste, scheduled tribes kind of classification that the government had made, where there was a certain direct exploitation of labor in a particular manner, like in Bengal, for example, in the coal fields or in certain forest regions. Now, with this kind of a loose kind of governance, the notion of the nation and the nation state were therefore kind of, you know, they fell into each other very easily because the government itself was saying that the nation state itself is made up of folk practices, so as to say, of local governance and so on and so forth. And that worked in various ways in the familial order as well. So, in some ways, that was the space which I think was appropriated. That kind of an ideology was appropriated by the filmmakers like Raj Kapoor, who took it for granted that the Nehruvian state was actually a very loose amalgam. Whether in practice or not, that's a different matter, but in theory and in certain areas in practice. Onto this, I would like to lay out the second thing which interests me much more as a historian is what does freedom mean? What does the nation mean to Indians starting from the early 20th century? And how did that connect up with the notion of the nation? And this is a very interesting idea because if a notion of freedom is being is being worked out during a period when the nation in the making is the biggest kind of idea, the most idealistic kind of idea that people are working with, there are a lot of very small practices which people in some ways started to look on as nationalist practices. Very, very simply put, like, in Bombay, for example, if you look at the newspapers, anything modern or anything that was kind of against what the British looked up upon us as, like, they looked upon us as backward people, not capable of taking care of our bodies and bathing properly. So if you bathed with soap, that became a nationalist kind of step. I mean, and the newspapers made use of that. So therefore, the notion of freedom and what a nation in the making was is a far more complex idea than we historians, with our textbookish notions of these words, would be able to figure out. That in some ways, the fact that one could move freely on trains and one could travel around, or one could become different from a traditional India and modernize, was as much part of thinking up a nation, thinking up notions of the nation as well as freedom together. So therefore, these ideas, at least in the, and I think it was particularly so because this was 20th century modernity with its onslaught of technology, ways of traveling, getting to destroying earlier ways of community formation and bringing all kinds of people together in this huge space where people could interact much more freely. There was an excitement